Perspective. My name's Chris. I'm a psychotherapist and consultant. Today, I'm going to dive into something, guys, that sits at the heart of what we live and love in power exchange. The line between hurt and harm. I'm going to get into this because not only do I see a lot of misconceptions around this, or deal with this when I'm working with people, but I think due to the watered down versions of what BDSM is becoming, we're no longer starting to understand where this line exists, right? Now, let's talk about some things we do understand. In the lifestyle, we can consent to being hurt, right? You can consent to interrogation scenes or intense impact, needle play, edge play, suspension, right? We can consent to those things. What we don't consent to is harm. So that's the starting point. Now, I know it sounds simple, but the difference is what separates connection from control and play from damage. Hurt can build trust. Harm breaks it. Now, I know that's going to sound a little bit confusing for some of you who might still be new and exploring or might seem be odd. Chris, why are you saying somebody can be hurt? Because that's what we're consenting to. BDSM isn't just some sort of performative measure. BDSM and in its interactions, the dominance, the control, the boot blacking, the standing on people, these are measures of hurt, physical pain or emotional pain. But we're consenting to it because we enjoy the practice, right? But when we look at this, right, sometimes these lines get blurred and what looks like devotion or discipline starts turning into emotional coercion. And that's what I want to unpack today. Most weeks I'm talking about trauma. Like today, I've gotten into a big, bout yet again about trauma and BDSM or attachment and psychology that shapes our choices and our relationships and how we interact with the lifestyle. But this one pulls all of that together. This is about what happens when consent starts to hide behind the surface. So when control here starts to sound like care, and how we begin to see that shift before it's too late. So before we get into all of that today, as I do every week, I want to thank all of you who keep showing up here. The messages, the shares, the comments, they matter. So if you find these episodes useful, please follow along. If you're on Spotify, using the app and that's how you're following the show, rate the show 5 stars. This allows others to find the show, right? If you're on YouTube or you're just finding me on YouTube, subscribe, leave a review, hit the follow button. It helps the show grow and helps me keep doing the kind of work that pushes our community towards awareness and accountability. And there's also a donation link in the show's description. So if you like to help keep these episodes going, anything big or small always helps. Now, let me get into a little bit of background here. When the community first tried to define safety, we used to say safe, sane, and consensual, SSC. And that practice is still pretty viable today. But over time, that's kind of evolved into risk-aware consensual kink, right? RAC. And then there's another acronym. I think a lot of these things start getting lost because we can stay firmly in safe, sane, and consensual, right? But if you want to evolve it, there's nothing wrong with that. But the reason here was simple. People started realizing that while physical risk can be managed, psychological harm isn't easy to spot. It hides in tone and pressure, silence, expectation, right? You can't always use a safe word to get out of that type of hurt. So here's the difference. Hurt is chosen. It's time limited, it's intentional, and it's built on trust. Harm lasts. It leaves confusion, guilt, or a part of you smaller than it was before. So what I want to look at today isn't about the blame. It's about the responsibility. Because power on either side of the slash takes awareness. And if you don't understand what you're holding, you can't keep it safe. So The first part of this I'm going to start with is the psychology of emotional coercion, because I think this is a really key point here to start all of this. So when people think about coercion, they picture something obvious, right? Pressure, threats, control. But in relationships and power exchange, it rarely looks that clear. Emotional coercion is quieter. It's the kind of manipulation that doesn't sound like control at all. It sounds like love or care or what you owe someone who's given you trust. And it trades attachment on fear, or worse, on validation. So the mind starts saying, I chose this, but your body says, I feel trapped. And that's where the problem starts. Emotional coercion works because it pulls on the same strings that make intimacy possible. It rewards connection, and then it takes it away. That's what psychologists call intermittent reinforcement, that whole push pull rhythm that conditions the nervous system to chase closeness even when it's unsafe. And I've talked about intermittent reinforcement in the past. I constantly see this come up. Unfortunately, um, in a lot of places on social media, it's not just a kink specific issue, it's a relationship issue. Maybe one day, you're getting praised and the next you're being punished or ignored. And that inconsistency itself becomes addictive. Your body learns to survive by earning back what was taken. So you stop asking, is this right for me? And you start asking, how do I keep them happy so it doesn't happen again? That's not obedience, that's survival. And this is where trauma bonding shows up. It's not about being weak, it's about the brain confusing intensity with safety. When every apology feels like relief and every punishment feels like attention, the system starts linking pain with love. The drop after a conflict kind of feels calm, but it's just the nervous system finally catching its breath, and you end up craving the very dynamic that's wearing you down. Now, people in those cycles often say, but we're just passionate, or we're both strong willed. Now, the truth is, control can easily dress itself as care. I just want the best for you. I wouldn't push you if I didn't believe in you. You said you trust me. Those phrases that turn authority into justification. And then there's the whole cognitive dissonance part, the tug of war between the role you agreed to and the feeling you can't shake. Part of you knows you consented, and another part of you knows that something just feels off. To reduce that tension, you start to rationalize. You tell yourself, hey, they're just helping me grow, or this is what devotion really looks like. So the more invested you become, the harder it is to question it. So you'd rather distort your perception than face the dynamic that might be crossing a line. And over time, that distortion becomes identity. And in DS, that identity fusion, when the role isn't just what you do, it's who you are, right? A dominant might start believing they're only valuable when they're in control, and a submissive might start believing they're only matter when they yield. Boundaries start to feel like a betrayal here, and agency starts to feel like disobedience. And that's how emotional coercion hides, sometimes in plain sight. And it doesn't start with shouting or punishment, it starts with slow emerging of the roles and worth into one, until one person's comfort depends on the other person's compliance. And here's the hard truth of all of this: the brain doesn't always know the difference between affection and manipulation until the pattern is shown. And that's why these dynamics can feel like devotion. The reinforcement, the apology, the relief, it all mimics intimacy. But once awareness enters the room, the illusion breaks. So you start noticing what your body's been saying all along. Emotional coercion thrives on that confusion, and it ends in clarity. And that's where we're going to head next, looking at how this shows up when dominance crossed the line and what it looks like from their side of the power exchange. And don't get me wrong, you all know that I tend not to like to rip on dominance. So the next part of this is we're going to get into submissives as well. right? Because both sides can do this. So, what happens when a Dom crosses the line? Let's talk about when dominance slips from structure into control, when guidance becomes policing. Now, when power exchange stops being mutual and it turns into management. And it doesn't all happen at once. Most of the time, it's something very subtle, something quiet, under the idea of quote unquote training. A Dom's going to say to you, I'm teaching you discipline. I know what you need better than you do. You'll thank me later. Now, on the surface, it sounds like authority, but underneath, it's about reassurance and reassurance that they'll still have power, still have respect, and they're going to still matter. That's the first red flag. Control reframed as training. Training should build capacity and confidence, not dependency. But when it's used to shape emotional compliance, it stops being about growth and starts being about ownership. And then there's the isolation disguised as discipline. And it might start with a phrase like, I don't think those friends respect your submission. Or, I need your focus on me right now. And it's easy to justify to yourself because the dynamic does revolve around focus and commitment. But when isolation replaces community, the submissive sense of self starts to shrink. And that's how dependency becomes obedience, and obedience becomes silence. And the third part of this pattern, gaslighting. That old chestnut. Redefining a partner's distress as defiance. Oh, I just think you're being emotional. You're overreacting again. You said trust me, so trust me. That kind of language doesn't correct behavior. It rewrites reality. It's going to teach somebody in the submissive role to doubt their own perception. And over time, they stop bringing up what hurts because it always is turned back on them. And none of this is because someone wakes up and decides to harm. Most coercive DOMs act from fear of losing control or not being respected or being seen as weak. Now, I'm not making an excuse. What I'm doing here is explaining some behavior because I've seen this firsthand and I've called them out on this. And it's not done to embarrass them, but it's done to catch them before a relationship becomes overly toxic, right? Because dominance can be intoxicating, but it's very fragile. When someone's identity is fused into their role, any challenge to authority feels like rejection. So they are going to what? Tighten their control, not to punish, but to protect their sense of self. And that's how insecurity turns into coercion. Here's how it sounds in real life, right? I'll give you a couple of examples. You're not a real submissive if you question me. Now, we've seen this all over social media, on X, Instagram posts, Fetlife, fetish.com, Facebook groups, right? That's the first quote they'll always come out and say. The next one, I'm the one who decides what's good for you. And my favorite, everything I do for you is growth. It's all for you. Those lines get repeated in enough dynamics to become culture, which is why they're so dangerous. They sound normal, but every one of them carries the same message: obedience over autonomy. And the psychological impact on the submissive side can be subtle but deep. Hypervigilance, always scanning for what's their dom's mood. Shame conditioning, where disapproval feels like a moral failure. And most painful of all is the loss of self-trust. That whole moment when the sub no longer knows if their discomfort is intuition or disobedience. And once that happens, true consent disappears. Healthy dominance doesn't take power, it stewards it. It protects the submissive's mind space instead of colonizing it. Real authority doesn't need constant proof. It's grounded in confidence, not compliance. A Dom's job is to create a frame where the submissive can explore safely, not to make them smaller in order to feel larger. So if you're a dominant listening, ask yourself, do they serve you out of trust or out of fear? Because if it's fear, what you have isn't devotion, it's damage control. And it doesn't matter how polished the language sounds, the nervous system always knows the truth. So when dominance becomes about validation, it stops being leadership. The healthiest DOMs I've ever met in my life have to remind, they never have to remind anyone who's in charge. They lead through steadiness, through care, through the security that comes from knowing power isn't something you take. It's something you're given because you've earned it. That's what ethical dominance looks like. And next, we're going to, turn the mirror the other direction now. We're going to talk about what happens when coercion comes from the submissive side of the slash, because it's important. Because I don't think we talk enough about the smaller side of the slash. We are always beating up on dominance, and I do agree dominants make a lot of mistakes, but that doesn't exclude submissives. So when subs manipulate the dynamic, this next part is going to be a little bit harder to talk about because it does flip the usual conversation. We often focus on dominance always crossing the line, right? But emotional coercion can move in both directions. I've seen it, and actually I've lived it. It doesn't look like control at first. It looks like need or pain or vulnerability, but the intent underneath is the same: to pull the emotional power back towards the self when it feels like it's slipping away. And that's what I mean by emotional topping from the bottom. It's when a submissive uses crisis or guilt or passivity to steer the dynamic instead of surrendering within it. It's control disguised as distress. Sometimes it's conscious. Most of the time, it's not. It's driven by fear of loss, fear of being unseen, fear of being left, fear of not even just being in control when they're supposed to surrender it. It can show up as feigned fragility or victimhood, where every correction, every pause becomes a wound. The submissive might cry or withdraw or frame the dominant as cold and unfeeling, knowing that guilt is a powerful reinforcer. Now, suddenly, the dom's attention isn't on the dynamic, it's on damage control. The energy shifts from structure to caretaking, and the sub regains control by becoming the one who needs saving. And then there's the emotional shutdown as punishment. The silent treatment, the cold distance, the refusal to communicate after a conflict. It's not a safe word, it's retaliation. And it works because most DOMs are wired to lead through engagement. When a submissive pulls away, the DOM often overreaches to reestablish that connection, right? So it starts creating a chase that flips the power dynamic completely. And then another form is manufactured dependency. You see it when a sub starts believing or convincing the dom to believe that they can self-regulate without them. And it sounds like, I need you to feel safe, or I fall apart without your control. And that's intoxicating at first to a dominant, especially a new dominant, because it feels like devotion. But it's really the start of entrapment through helplessness. And then there's a deeper layer of manipulation: weaponizing sex or love. And that's when intimacy becomes a tool of a bond, right? Offered, withheld, dangled to gain control. Some subs withhold sex to punish or use sexual access as a reward. Others lean on love itself as leverage. If you really cared, you'd want me. Or I only feel close when you claim me. It's not about connection anymore. It's about security through control. And for the dominant, it creates a lot of confusion. Was that aftercare or appeasement? Was that intimacy or obligation? So when love or desire become negotiation tools, the trust at its core of the power exchange begins to rot. And the DOMs start leading from guilt, not grounded authority. And this is where attachment protest behavior often takes root. When someone feels abandoned or unseen, they protest through extremes, right? They start clinging, testing, withdrawing, or provoking conflict just to feel contact again. The nervous system doesn't care if the connection is healthy. It just wants proof it's still there. And in kink, that volatility often gets romanticized as passion. But what's really happening is the body's panic being misread as chemistry. Now, over time, all of these cycles build learned helplessness. So when a sub stays disempowered long enough, they start believing they can't act, they can't decide, they can't cope without being led. It's not submission anymore, it's dependency. And that dependency pulls a Dom into constant rescue, feeding the exhaustion and the guilt loops that blur the line between care and control. And underneath it all, you'll often find trauma reenactment. Two nervous systems replaying old stories of control, abandonment, or worth. And the Dom becomes the fixer, and the sub becomes the wounded one, right? The dynamic becomes therapy in disguise, and it's not conscious. It's a psyche trying to rewrite history through repetition. That's why ethical submission matters just as much as ethical dominance. Real submission doesn't manipulate through emotion, it trusts the frame. It brings awareness and honesty and the ability to own one's triggers without turning them into tools or weapons against somebody else. At its best, submission isn't weakness or dependence, it's strength with direction. A conscious choice to yield from stability, not fear. And when that balance holds, DS becomes what it's meant to be. Two people meeting in trust, not trading wounds. So next, I want to move into what are the warning signs, because this is one of the other questions I got, which kind of helped me frame this whole show today. Chris, I can't recognize the signs. Well, there are a lot that are out there. But what you're really talking about is the data. What's all that data telling me? And those are the things you got to start piecing together. And sadly, over time, without if you've had nothing but healthy relationships, well, that's great. You're not going to have to worry about this stuff. But if you've had enough bad ones, you start recognizing these things, right? These become the small shifts that tell you that hurt is turning into harm, often before anyone says it out loud. So let's talk about warning signs. Most people don't realize how early harm starts showing itself. It's rarely dramatic, right? There's no big explosion or some sort of form of obvious abuse. It's quiet. It's subtle, right? Things that feel off but are easy to explain away. That's the first sign, is usually emotional confusion after a scene. You come out of play feeling unsettled or heavy instead of grounded and floating. Maybe the scene technically went fine, but everyone consented, no boundaries were crossed, but something still doesn't sit right. So you start replaying it in your head. You're trying to figure out why you feel uneasy. That confusion is your nervous system's first red flag. It's telling you something. Something didn't line up with safety, even if your mind can't name it yet. So what's the next warning sign? It's guilt for asserting a limit. You finally speak up about something that doesn't feel right, and instead of feeling respected, you walk away feeling shame. You start worrying that you've disappointed somebody or that you've broken the dynamic. Healthy power exchange welcomes feedback. Unhealthy power exchange punishes it emotionally. And I want you to listen to that. Replay that part again if you need to. If you feel smaller for protecting yourself, that's not discipline. It's control, right? You have to remember, I've talked about this in the past. If you don't remember, or your first time you're listening, I've talked about this in the past. You should always have check-ins outside of the dynamic where you're stepping out of your roles. Both of you are coming together. You're talking about your scenes, where you want your relationship to go, how you can grow, stuff you want to do, what you want to learn. It's a reflection. If you can't do that with ease, if it feels off, if you feel small, or you've got to hold back, that's another warning sign, right? Another sign here is losing connection with your community. Maybe you're going to stop talking to your friends who ask too many questions, or you hide what's really going on because you don't want to make your partner look bad. That's isolation creeping in. It doesn't need to be forced. Sometimes all it takes is subtle conditioning that your relationship or your dynamic is just different, and outsiders won't understand. Trust me, they do, because they recognize it for what it is. And that's how people get separated from the support that could help them see it clearly. Then comes the pressure to constantly prove your worth or your obedience. Pardon me. Every interaction feels like a test. How quickly you respond, how perfectly you follow, how little you question. You start confusing performance with devotion. And the problem is, no one can sustain that. You end up living in anticipation, right? Always waiting for the next approval or correction. That's not submission, it's anxiety with a collar on. And let's talk about what your body's telling you, because the body doesn't lie. It always gives you truth first, even when your mind argues against it. So if you start feeling chronic tension, your shoulders are tight, your stomach is knotted, your jaw's locked, right? That's not excitement, that's bracing. When you feel nausea before play, or you can't get settled afterward, that's your nervous system signaling that the experience no longer feels safe. Insomnia after scenes is another big one. If your body can't rest, it's because it's still in survival mode. Now, there, of course, can be other factors that are at play, but then those factors should be addressed before you're getting into play, right? Because I know those questions are going to come up. That's why I'm addressing it. Then there's this next part, the emotional numbing. That slow drift into not feeling much at all. You stop reacting, you stop crying, stop laughing. It's your body's last defense when it can't fight or flee. It just shuts down to survive. And people often mistake that calm for stability, but it's actually freeze, the most silent trauma response there is. These are the moments when hurt turns into harm. And here's the distinction you can never forget: the body doesn't lie. If your nervous system feels trapped, if you catch yourself walking on eggshells, apologizing for your own discomfort, or rationalizing pain that doesn't feel anchored in care, your dynamic isn't safe, no matter what words are used. A healthy DS dynamic, a healthy relationship, should regulate your system, not hijack it. You should come out of a scene feeling connected and clear, even if it's intense. You should never leave feeling ashamed or unsure of your reality, right? The truth is, the body will tell you long before your brain catches up. All you have to do is listen. I finally want to talk about here, how do we get out and start healing? What recovery actually looks like after experiencing emotional coercion or manipulation, and how you rebuild trust in yourself and empower exchange again. Leaving a coercive dynamic isn't a clean break. I'm not pausing there. This is not some dramatic effect, because I too have experienced this a very long time ago, and it was devastating. And when I think about how much went on, I often have gone back and go, why didn't you listen? Why didn't you see the signs? Right? It's because it was messy and confusing, and it was very painful. You don't just walk away from the person, you walk away from the version of yourself that live inside that relationship. That's why the first stage after leaving isn't freedom. It was grief. It is grief. You grieve what you thought you had, what you hoped it would be, what you were told it was going to evolve into, and even the safety of the pattern itself. And it's strange, but familiar pain can feel safe, right? It can even feel safer than uncertainty. So when you finally leave, your nervous system just crashes. You might question yourself, you might feel guilt, or even miss them terribly. That doesn't mean you made the wrong choice. It means you're human, and it means your body is just adjusting to life without that cycle. And that's where all of that's churning up now. But that's where the healing starts. with normalizing the chaos. You might crave the contact again. You might want to apologize and just to stop all that discomfort. But what you're really chasing is regulation. The sense of predictability your body lost when the dynamic ended. That's why you have to retrain your nervous system to find calm in healthy ways, not just through reenacting an old pattern. And I just was talking about that this past week with somebody. Nervous system retraining is very slow work. It means grounding yourself, even when it feels empty. Simple things like breathing, movement, writing, getting outside, touching textures, looking at colors, right? When you're having these moments, you're looking around and you're saying to yourself, I know I'm in a memory, but I am where I'm at presently. I am safe. And you ground yourself in reality. That's why they're called grounding techniques, right? It's learning that peace doesn't have to feel boring or unsafe. So for people coming out of high intensity dynamics, calm can actually feel very foreign, even threatening to somebody, because the body's, been conditioned to equate chaos with connection. So rebuilding tolerance for calm is one of the hardest parts of recovery, and it takes the longest. You just have to keep at it, because then one day, when one of those moments comes up, you notice very quickly how you're starting to have retrained your system to re-regulate. So that little activation doesn't last as long. And then it clicks over for you, and then you start really doing more of the work. And through that repetition, your system gets retrained. The next part, though, it's all about reclaiming agency. Now, after coercion, even small decisions can feel overwhelming. And saying no might even trigger guilt or panic because somewhere along the line you learned that boundaries meant punishment. So you have to start with small acts, choosing how you spend your time, what you'll eat, when you're going to rest. You rebuild the muscle memory of autonomy. Every no becomes proof that you can protect yourself without losing love. That's not defiance, it's recovery. Somebody's going to ask me, I know inevitably, why? Why would I lose all these things? Because when your nervous system is fired up, when you are bouncing in an unhealthy or emotionally manipulative or coercive dynamic, right? When you're being gaslit, what ends up happening is your system doesn't know when to rest. It doesn't know how to, fuel the machine. And people who aren't experiencing this don't necessarily understand this. So these small decisions, all about reclaiming your agency, become very important. But you start small so you can handle it. And you build with one act on top of another. That also helps in retraining your system. And as you stabilize, you begin repatterning trust. This is where healing really deepens. You start learning that power and safety can coexist, that dominance can be rooted in care, and that submission can be an act of confidence rather than survival. But it takes time. It takes new experiences that contradict the old story your body still believes. You might find this through therapy, through community mentors, or through safe partners who understand repair work. Just as long as you're not leaning on the latter parts of that to do your therapy. I want to be clear on that. Leave the professional work to the professionals. But if you need people to talk to or people who understand, absolutely. Build your support network. Sometimes this could even come in the forms of writing, like journaling what you feel without editing, right? Let the truth of your experience find its voice. You can't think your way out of trauma. You have to process it through experience. Practical recovery isn't glamorous, it's quiet. It's showing up to therapy when you don't know what to say. It's reaching out to people who see you clearly, even when you'd rather isolate. Or it's, reading and learning and educating yourself about dynamics so that what, happened doesn't define what comes next. The hardest part of all of this is forgiving yourself, not for leaving, but for staying as long as you did. Most people stay because they're trying to make meaning out of something painful, because they believed love could fix it, because leaving felt like failure. Healing doesn't mean that, let me back that up. Healing means that you didn't fail, you adapted. You did what you had to do to survive the moment you were in. And I want you to remember that. There's a lot of you right now I'm speaking to, especially directly, because I hear you and I see you and I understand that because I've lived this. I have my own versions of what I went through and healed through, right? Recovery isn't about becoming who you were before. It's about becoming someone who trusts themselves enough to never lose that voice again. That's where real power begins, not in control, not in surrender, but in choice. And I don't know if you all remember a few months ago, I did a show on being outed because somebody in San Francisco, a group, which is kind of ironic, a group who teaches about privacy and consent and respect, which they offered me none, decided to out me, right? But I didn't lose my control. I didn't surrender to the moment. I made a choice. I did react because it flared up some old things, but then I reclaimed my voice a couple of days later. Let me bring this full circle. What it means to carry that awareness forward and hold that power with fear, right? I want you to understand that you're not broken because you've experienced these things. You just have to learn to find your way again. It takes time. But you got to have some grace, especially with yourself. As I wind this down here, power isn't the problem. Ignorance of power is. Every scene, every exchange, every word of control or surrender it's a psychological contract, right? We're all accountable for how we sign it. That's what this whole conversation has been about today. Awareness, responsibility, knowing what you're really holding when someone gives you their trust. If you've been through harm in a dynamic, I want you to remember something. You're not broken, you're not fragile, you're not misunderstood. You're going to be hurting, and I know you're going to be in pain, but you can find your way back again. Your nervous system did exactly what it was built to do. It tried to keep you safe, and maybe it learned compliance meant survival, and maybe it believed calm only came after the chaos. That pattern isn't weakness, it's loyalty to what once protected you. But healing asks for something different. It asks you to stop treating vigilance as love, to stop confusing intensity as proof, to start believing that safety doesn't have to come at the cost of yourself. So when you start rebuilding after harm, it's easy to question everything: the lifestyle, the roles you choose, your own judgment. Don't throw away the parts that made you feel alive. Just learn to hold them with clarity. Power exchange can be beautiful when it's rooted in care, in consent that breathes, in curiosity instead of control. That's where trust actually grows. And as I'm winding this down, as I do every week, I have a question for all of you. And here's the question I want to leave you with. When does obedience stop being devotion and start being survival? I want you to think about that. That's the line worth paying attention to, because once you can name that moment, you never lose yourself in it again. We can consent to hurt. We cannot consent to harm. And knowing the difference is what keeps this lifestyle safe, insane, and truly consensual. And I don't want to lose that. None of us want to lose that. We don't want to lose that in all of the arcs that we're doing inside of this. That's what a lot of these new people coming in, there's nothing wrong. I want the lifestyle to breathe and grow and keep evolving. But the problem becomes that we're not taking enough responsibility to learn the chosen roles. It's why last week, and I'm going to put it out again, I want to challenge those in different lifestyles that have merged into this one. I want to talk about that stuff. I want to talk about swinging and polyamory and BDSM and how there's distinct, I've talked about how they are very distinctively separate. They're not the same. Their levels of consent are different. We need to understand that. It's not just what comes with each one. And I'm not saying you don't have a place here, but you have to evolve if you're coming into another community and roll with their rules, not just use yours as the framework and then that's it. Doesn't work that way, right? I do have some other really good shows as we kind of are screaming towards the end of the year coming up. I want to talk about. I do have an idea about I don't know. I haven't covered the lying thing, or maybe I have. I don't know. There's a lot of stuff I'm trying to get done. I'm trying to get here. Hi there, Katsuno, and I've just got to coordinate with him. That's me, not him. It's kind of like it's a red leather all over again. So I apologize, my friend, if you're out there. But I have a couple shows about emotional redirection and competing for vulnerability. So basically, if you're hurting and you're looking, you want to talk to your partner, and then all of a sudden it becomes about their pain and not about yours, right? So now you're in pain, but now then you're taking care of them, right? Or another one on smothering your partner with just too much affection, right? I do want to talk about again, and look, I hate to tell you all, we need to become very well understanding about all this, but the whole boyfriend girlfriend apps AI that are coming around, they're getting better. It's right now in which I really wouldn't call it AI. It's more algorithmic responses, but look, I'm not an expert in this field, right? I don't know how far away we are from AGI, which is artificial general intelligence. That's where it can compete at the level with human thought. From what I understand from the experts, it's somewhere in the next 5 years. But every week pardon me, every week I'm reading or watching or catching an article on this stuff. It's getting better and better. And with isolation growing, these things are going to start replacing it. And I'm sure it's already out there, but there's going to be submissive or dominance partners, and you're going to pay for that companionship. And what's that going to do? Computer driven companionship. So that's a show I've gone on hold. I'm still looking into this. I'm still been reaching out into this community for a while. I've got something on deck for cuckolding and the emotional impact of it. Right. There isn't a whole lot of research. So if there's any of you out there that are cuckolds or cuckoldresses, if I'm pronouncing that right, or anybody in that lifestyle that wants to come and talk about it, its impacts, I am trying to find some research on it. I really want to get into it. I had some other things like predicament, bondage, chastity, dollification. But I really don't know. I'm trying to see how they're going to tie. I know I keep getting these questions. I do appreciate it. Before I get to your famous now, I want to have a couple of quick shout outs. First, Uruguay. Hello, welcome to the show. Thank you for listening. I'm glad you're here. I'm only stating your country because that's what you asked me to do. So welcome. Thank you for listening. I'm glad it's helping you form a community down there, right? And give some centered ideas. That's wonderful. Please keep drawing on vast number of ideas. There's so many wonderful people out there who have a lot of structure. There are free. Those downloads are absolutely free. You don't have to pay me for any of them. Please take them, use them. If you need to translate them, go ahead. Totally consent to that. Right? Couple new followers from like Finland and Norway. Not that there's not a lot of you already, but they asked me to say hello to your little group out there. I can't remember because I can't pronounce the town. I'm very sorry. I don't speak Finnish, right? Or Swedish, so I'm struggling. But I did go and take a look. It really looks awesome. Colors are changing in that part of the world. Iceland, hello. Reykjavik. My gosh. If I wanted to go, I want to pop up to the country. I got to have some words with you all because your country has now somehow made BDSM a sexual orientation. I'm kind of confused on that. But that's a different show for another day. Might be a future topic. Who knows? Right? I've kind of argued against that one in the past. But that's kind of on deck. There's not much time between now and the end of the year. I think we got a couple weeks left here of November, and then we have what's left, in December, and I'm only going to do, I don't know, maybe another month. I was trying to hope to hit like 50 episodes this year, but who knows? Maybe the Findoms are going to come back out again, and we're going to have another rousing bout after I did a couple of years ago. That will be interesting. I'll call that Findoms 2.0. I don't have a very high opinion of the current status quo of what fin dominance is, right? That's because I look at the other side of it, but there are some I've met that do it the way it was intended for, but I'm not going to get into all that. That's not why we're talking about this today, right? Just some upcoming stuff, upcoming thoughts. You're famous now. I don't have a lot this week. Actually, I didn't receive a lot of hate. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I will say this. I'm going to comment on something I saw today because it's not so much you're famous now, but it's something that kind of irks me in the community. People are using anecdotal evidence, right, or bias when they are talking about trauma and BDSM, right? And I'm I get confused a lot by this when it comes out. Um More so because first off, there's a lot of evidence to prove, and I'm not going to go into this now. That's a whole nother show, but I've talked about this in the past. There's a whole lot of evidence to disprove when that people are, pathologically more unhealthy or have more trauma coming into BDSM. That's 100% not true, right? The studies have been done, and uh, yeah, I don't really know why. But if we surround ourselves, let me put it to you this way. If you are, this is no, I'm just grabbing a city, please don't freak out, right? But if you're in some small group in Cleveland, Ohio, right? And that group consists of 10 people, and all of you have starting your journey in the lifestyle and you have some various form of trauma, you are going to all 10 of you are going to think everybody in BDSM must have trauma. That is only anecdotal, right? Backed up by your group that you're in. That's not the way it works, right? Exposure isn't evidence. And this isn't me just giving some sort of opinion on this. This is what decades of peer-reviewed work constantly shows. Right? It's not me, it's not new. And I'm not going to start debating all this. I've spent my, over 10 years reading this stuff. If you start asking me to give you journal articles, so first off, some of them are paid for, you're going to have to go out and get it on your own. But I'm not going to do the work for you. If you're curious about what I'm saying, where I'm backed up by, my stuff is backed up by scholarly journal work, then you need to go find it. I'm not here to, I'm done. I'm not here to prove myself. I know what I'm talking about. If that's problematic for somebody, that's on them. That's not on me. Right? So if you are asking me to do your work for you, I'm not going to do it. It's very easy to go into Google Scholar and start looking. It's there. Most recent articles have come out in even the last few years. And there's more growing articles that support BDSM as a healthy functioning relationship. More so, there's one that's being worked on right now, I'm really excited about, that shows that what traditional relationships, or what we would call vanilla relationships, could learn from modeling their relationships in a similar style to BDSM. Not the functionality of it, right? Not the fetish side of it, but the relationship structure where the consent and the autonomy and the agency and all of these things comes in, right? So we start removing the guesswork. Anyway, so yeah, no real big, dissenters are always around. I'm not, luckily, just kind of maybe dodged a bullet this week. I don't know. I'm back at 100%. So If you come at me, I'm gonna be firing all barrels. And I've got tons. I don't know. I have my own private collection. I've probably got about a couple hundred articles here. No, I'm not going to share them with you because I actually paid for them. And if you want it, you just got to go sign up and buy it. You got to pay those people for doing their work. That's why they put it out there, right? That's how they keep supporting their work, and that's why I pay for it. Anyway, let me know what you thought about the show today, right? More so about the topic. This is a really important topic. We need to understand the difference between hurt and harm, right? We need to. But the latter is starting to show up more and more. And it's not just because there's a crossover effect or a crossover event going on with other lifestyles, right? It's happening because people are doing things that are unhealthy and maladaptive. And that's where we're at. Okay. So light up the comments, talk about this, share your experiences, keep this moving forward. Until next time, everybody, be safe, stay keen.